Welcome to Launchpad, the unique radio show and podcast that celebrates new book releases and the authors that created them. Now, let's take off with your host, Grace Sammon.
This is Launchpad. Welcome to episode 34 with Louella Bryant, Sherry Hobbs, Cary Lowe, and Amanda Schiavo. I'm so excited today because we are welcoming 4 writers from Black Rose Writing. They'll share their memoirs, their biographies, and their novels, travel with us to the Renaissance, to the times of the Titanic and World War II, to the present day. You'll meet historic figures and marvel at personal journeys, all the way to finding your very next best book. We're live today in the Bookish Road Trip, and we're so excited to welcome these authors today. Hopefully, Louella Bryant will be joining us in a bit. And right now, on behalf of Mary Helen Sheriff, we wish you a happy new year. And this is being recorded in front of a live audience. If you are with us live, please feel free to add comments, make questions up for our guests. We're so excited that we do have people watching us today, and thank you for joining us. I want to start with Louella Bryant, who hasn't had a chance to join us yet. She has written an amazing novel called Sheltering Angel. It's a true story about the Titanic. So we'll talk more about that as we move through our program today. Sherry Hobbs with Mac, The Wind Beneath My Wings, a biography. Cary Lowe, Becoming an American, a memoir. And Amanda Schiavo with In Her Own Right, a novel of Lady Mary Tudor. I want to start, Sherry, with you. Please tell us about your book, Mac, The Wind Beneath My Wings.
Thank you so much. Yes, well, growing up, I too was a baby boomer post World War II, like Cary. And growing up, I knew that my father had been a pilot in World War II, and I knew his plane had been shot down, and that he and his surviving crew had spent 3 weeks navigating the Japanese islands before they were rescued when he was in Guadalcanal. But it wasn't until I retired and I opened a box of memorabilia and found letters that he had written home during the war. And once I saw that, I found other commendations and articles, and I realized what a unique story this was. And when I started to do the research for the book, the ditching of the plane and the 3 weeks on the island was, of course, a very exciting story. But I found that there was so much more to tell. He spent a year in Guadalcanal flying 52 missions in a plane that was put together so quickly and so haphazardly that men were more likely to die in accidents than they were in actual combat. And then after spending a year flying those missions and surviving, he was called back to the United States to train on another new bomber, the B-56, or 29, excuse me, which was the one designed to carry the atomic bomb. And that's when he was stationed in Guam and flew another 30 missions to Tokyo. So his war story was interesting. But part 2, I sort of slide into a little bit of a memoir where I recall the man I knew growing up. And we lived in Vietnam when he was air attaché. And I also had the opportunity to live in France when he was in NATO. So it's the story of his life as told through my eyes in the second part.
What an amazing story. I'm so glad you brought it to light. We'll hear more about Mac in more of our program. Cary Lowe, tell us about Becoming American.
Thank you, Grace. My book is a memoir. It follows my story of having grown up in post-war Europe in Austria and Germany with parents who were Holocaust survivors. My father had been a refugee from Vienna who narrowly escaped before the onset of the war. My mother was from Slovakia, and she was in hiding through most of the war and survived with just one other member of her family who also had been in hiding. They separately came to the United States after the war and met there, and then returned to Europe because my father was recruited to work on the staff of the Nuremberg War Crimes Tribunal. And so when he finished that work, he went to work for the occupation government in post-war Austria. And that's when I was born. Ironically, my hometown of Braunau am Inn was actually Adolf Hitler's birthplace. So there's great ironies in this story. But in any event, we lived in Europe until I was in my early teens. And then we all moved to the United States through my father's work at different military intelligence agencies. I wound up going to high school in the Boston area, but then moving to California to go to college and staying here the rest of my life. Here, I became a military officer, a lawyer, a journalist, a college professor, had a great varied professional career. And each of those steps drew me more and more into American culture and politics. I got very involved in American politics, working on political campaigns, never running for office myself, but being involved with a lot of notable people who did. And becoming very involved in organizations and causes that were very prominent and hopefully made a big impact during those years. I wrote this book because I was concerned about how much negative feeling there was toward immigrants and the sense that immigrants weren't becoming real Americans. And I wanted to demonstrate that, at least in my experience, one could be an immigrant who came here at any age, got engaged in America in every possible way, the economy, the politics, the culture, and made a big contribution, hopefully, to those things. And that would have a positive impact on the dialogue going on in this country around immigration and what it really means to be an American.
Very timely, I think, for sure. Last but not least, we have Amanda Schiavo, who has written a book not in her own voice, but sharing the voice of Lady Mary Tudor in her own right. Amanda, tell us about your book.
Yeah, so In Her Own Right is the first of two books in a series I'm writing about Mary's life, and it tells the story of Queen Mary I of England on her journey from being born a princess to being declared a bastard to triumphing as the very first woman to rule England in her own right, England's first queen regnant. And I really wanted to tell Mary's story because she tends to be sort of a side character in a lot of mainstream Tudor fiction. And she has this myth, this legend about her. She's Bloody Mary. And I wanted to really get to the heart of who the actual woman was. And although it is a novel, I stayed as true to Mary's real life as I possibly could. Her story really didn't need any embellishment. So it really was just about learning about who Mary was and kind of putting the legend to rest and introducing the real Mary to the world.
And this is the first of two books?
Yes, this is the first of two books. You're going to follow Mary on her journey from a little girl, England's princess, the pearl of her father's world, as she was known. Then she is an outcast. Her father disowns her. She has a very traumatic life and eventually works her way and fights very hard to become Queen of England. And that's kind of where the first book is going to end, in her moment of triumph. And I'm currently working on the sequel where we're going to get into a lot of the turmoil and trauma that was her 5 years on the throne.
Well, you mentioned the word trauma, and I want to go back since Louella hasn't had a chance to join us. Louella Bryant has written a book called Sheltering Angel, a novel. It's the true story of the Titanic. And it's an interesting story in that there's a servant on the boat who becomes friends with two of the very posh passengers. And one of the male posh passenger perishes on the Titanic, but the servant on the boat is seen swimming along one of the sides of the boat. And the woman, Florence Cummings, pulls him to safety, and it is their story about their lifelong bond. So trauma seems to fill each of your books in one way or another. Sherry, let's go back to you and the trauma that Mac, your dad, experienced 3 weeks alone after being shot down on his maiden voyage. Tell us more about Mac, the wind beneath my wings.
Certainly, but Grace, if I could say beforehand that I'm
Sure.
disappointed that Louella wasn't able to make it. I read her book, and it's just an amazing book, so well written. The characters come alive. You feel like you're on the Titanic and experiencing it with them. So I had questions I wanted to ask her, and I really would encourage everyone to read it. It's wonderfully well written.
Oh, that's
But
super generous, and we'll reach out to Luella and ask her to join us post show, and she can do that through the Facebook group and through the comments. And just before you get a chance, Sherry, Cary Lowe, one of our viewers, says, "My best friend is from Nigeria. She became a citizen after living in the States for about 13 years, and she owns 5 businesses, and glad you wrote your memoir." So Cary Lowe and Michelle Ann Waite, thank you for that. Sherry, now back
yeah,
to you. Let's keep that theme of
okay.
trauma going.
All right. So what happened was this was his very first mission from Guadalcanal. And these were young men. These were he was a little older because he had had a year of college and had taken his private pilot's license before he enlisted when Pearl Harbor was bombed. But most of these young men were 18, 19 years old. And they had to, out of Guadalcanal, fly what they called up the slot to which was the area of the ocean between all the islands. And all of these islands were Japanese held. They had to fly up the slot to a harbor where their target was to bomb ships in this harbor. And as I said, this was their first mission being fired at. So when they got there, the first 2 planes that bombed successfully the ship in the harbor, they were shot down and blown up over the target. And my dad was in the 3rd plane, and his plane was severely wounded. And as he was going down in the Pacific, the men in the back, they lost communications. The wing was on fire. It must have been a horrendous scene to be a part of. The men in the back, not knowing what was going to happen, they jumped out, parachuted out, and were strafed by the Japanese. But 5 of them, including my father, when he landed the plane in the water, made it in a raft to an island and spent 3 weeks navigating through these islands, living on coconuts. And it I'm sure was extremely traumatic. And
Wow.
and they were finally rescued by natives who helped them get to the Australian Coast Guards.
Well, that description makes me feel like I was in the plane with your dad. So thank you for sharing that. Cary Lowe, let's go back to that same theme of trauma, because I can't imagine. I know Holocaust survivors and I know children of Holocaust survivors, but it truly is something unimaginable for those of us who didn't live it and live it up close. How did that shape your parents and shape you?
Well, it certainly traumatized my mother greatly for her whole life. She had tremendous difficulty ever talking about her experiences during those years and the loss of most of her family who died in concentration camps. My father was fortunate in that his immediate family at least made it out. But their experiences certainly colored my own perceptions because I was growing up there in post-war Europe, surrounded by the very people who had so recently murdered most of my family. While they all presumably wanted to forget about what had happened, it was certainly hard for us to forget about it. And yet you have to deal with it. I think I developed a certain stoicism about it because I learned that from my parents and the way they dealt with it. But many years later, my mother started to open up about her experiences during the war. And so I'm able to tell a lot of her story in the early part of my book. And it's pretty amazing what she and one of her sisters did to escape and survive, and being nearly captured by Nazi soldiers on multiple occasions, walking through a mountain range in the middle of winter in just street clothes, and joining a guerrilla army group, and just really amazing stuff. When I think of what she was like in my life and how tough she had to have been to go through all that successfully. And I think that inspired, I'd like to think, a certain toughness in me, that if she could do that much, certainly I should be able to deal with a certain amount of adversity in my life.
Important
Absolutely.
lessons to learn. Amanda, with Lady Mary Tudor, certainly dealt with many, many diversities. Why was it important for you to tell her story?
Mary has this reputation as, being Bloody Mary, and she is held to a very different standard because she's the first woman to rule England in her own right. She really also there's a lot of religious turmoil and there's a lot of religious trauma. She was Catholic, and eventually England does become a country where Protestantism is rooted in the national identity. So I think that also had a lot to do with sort of besmirching her legend and kind of creating her into being this more Bloody Mary character, this sort of ghost, the sort of legend versus who the actual woman was. And I've always been interested in Tudor history. I've read Tudor fiction my whole life, and it just got to a point where I was really eager to read a novel about Mary, with her kind of being more balanced and nuanced. And there, like I said before, there's not that many of them in the mainstream. So I decided that this was something that I was going to do, that I was going to tell her story. And there was a lot of moments. We were talking about trauma earlier. There's a lot of moments in Mary's story that I really felt like I could relate to her in terms of her family dynamic. And I could really take her and put her into a modern lens.
I love that each of you in your own way are giving voice to past figures, even as you bring, the current lessons, if you will, to each of us today. One of our viewers wants to know how long each of you have been writing. So, Amanda, let's just go back to you for a minute. How long have you been writing?
Oh, sure. Well, I've been in journalism for 10 years, so a long time, but this is my first novel, and took me about 3 years of writing this. So I would say about 3 years of being a fiction author.
And Cary Lowe, you too have been a journalist. How long have you been writing?
I started writing back in the late 70s, but most of my writing has been in the form of op-ed essays for newspapers or articles for professional journals. This book, Becoming American, is my first full-length book. And although I now have a second book that's just been accepted for publication, that's also a kind of memoir, but is a series of travel stories involving me and my wife, who is disabled, and the, I'll say, interesting experiences we have traveling in that capacity.
Fascinating. So, Sherry Hobbs, you and your writing, did you not start till after you retired, did I read?
Well, that's when I started writing books. I wrote my memoir after I retired because I had sort of an interesting, unconventional life with my father being in the Air Force. We lived over in Saigon before the war, and also got to live in Paris in my high school years. So, and then I had after that, moved back, went to college, got married to my college sweetheart, and moved all over the country again. So that was Bird of Paradise, which is someone that never stays long in the same place. But so that was my first book. This is my second book that I have written, and yes, both were done in the last 4 years.
Amazing. And Louella Bryant, who wrote Sheltering Angel, this is actually her 9th book. So she has
Oh.
taught fiction and writing as well, and she's an editor as well. So Louella has also certainly had a great deal of experience in writing. Now, each of you are with a press called Black Rose Writing. How did you find your way to Black Rose Writing? Anyone can start it.
Well, I'll start. When I had finished writing Becoming American, I simply started contacting independent publishers when I was not successful in getting an agent to take me to one of the few major publishers. And Black Rose happened to be the first one that responded positively to me. I looked them up, and I talked to other authors who had published with them, and all the signs were positive. So I went ahead and signed with them and have had a good experience. And so I've just literally this week signed a contract for this second book with them.
Oh, wonderful. Amanda.
I actually discovered Black Rose Writing through a social media post of a fellow Black Rose writing author, Tom Storita, who wrote a book called Delta. He happened to be a teacher of mine from high school, and I saw his post, and I said, okay, I got to keep these guys in the back of my mind. And when it came time to start submitting the manuscript, that's where I went first.
And Sherry.
Well, my first book was self-published because memoirs are typically more difficult to find publishers for, because unless you're a celebrity or somebody well-known, it's just not that easy. So I did self-publish the first one. And then just as Cary did, I started researching smaller publishers, and just ran into Black Rose Writing, and they're very family oriented. They have a network of writers, and it's very welcoming. And what else can I say about them? It's been a wonderful experience.
It's been a great
being a
press
part
for
of the group.
It's been a great press for us to partner with. I know several of their authors as well. And it really is a pleasure to partner with Black Rose Writing. And Mary Helen Sheriff, who is the author marketing coach, which I partner with here on the Launchpad series. We're just very, very happy to have so many coming up this season on the Launchpad series of Black Rose writers, as well as the She Writes Press writers. I'd like to talk a little bit about how the writing process has changed you. I know that I have 7 books with my name on the front, and every single book has changed me in some way. Amanda, let's start with you.
I think one of the more difficult things for me, from just sort of a technicality or a technical standpoint, is trying to switch from writing as a journalist to writing as an author, where in journalism, obviously you're quick, you're to the point, you got to get the facts out there. Whereas with a novel and fiction, you're writing, you want to be more descriptive, and you want to have a little bit, you're telling a story a little bit in a different kind of way, and there's got to be a different kind of flow. And I always tease myself, because I wrote such a short novel. I wrote like a journalist when I wrote this. So that was kind of an interesting experience, but also just from the standpoint of getting to know Mary, and even though she lived so long ago and we had very, very different lives that we both led or are leading, it was a really I felt very connected to her. It was a really sort of empowering experience, and feeling that connection with Mary almost made me not want to publish it because it felt very private. At the heart of Mary's story is, like, it's family dynamics, it's danger, it's trauma, it's love, it's life. And really bonding with Mary as I told her story, it just became so personal that it was a very scary thing to put that out into the world.
I love that description, and I think anytime we put our work out into the world, it is very scary. Cary Lowe, tell me that same story.
Yeah, I think the process of writing the first book really made me a more introspective person, because it's a memoir. So I had to really reach back into the far depth of my memory and consciousness to recall a lot of things that had happened, especially during my growing up years, and to try to do that in as accurate a way as possible and not let wishful thinking get in the way of telling a true story. So I went through a lot of drafts, adding, changing, trying to make the story as truthful as I could make it. And that really was a long-term effort that I was pretty happy with ultimately. But interestingly, after first publishing the book, which occurred for the first time 3 years ago, the version that's now just been published is a second edition that is substantially expanded with a lot of new material that I didn't think to include in the first edition. And that things I thought about and recalled during the intervening time. So it was a great experience in, should I say, self-analysis and introspection. And I think I've come out of it as knowing myself and knowing the people in my life a lot better than when I began the process.
It certainly does change this. Sherry, last but not least, this will be our last question.
All right. Well, I would echo what Cary said. Certainly introspection. It made me very appreciative of the life I've led and the father that I had. The writing process itself, just connecting with other people and finding so many people who have had the military brat experience or had been veterans. I connected with long lost relatives. Just was a wonderful process and feeling of connecting, I think, is the main feeling that I get from it.
Well, I think that each of your books has changed you. I think it will change our readers. In closing, I'd just like to ask each of you to very quickly, Sherry, where can people get both of your books?
Well, they can get them just about everywhere. And I didn't hold this up earlier, but this is Mac, the latest one, and the other, Bird of Passage. They're available online. They're available, of course, at Barnes & Noble, just about anywhere books are sold.
Wonderful. Amanda?
Same. You can find it on the Black Rose Writing website. You can find it on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Target, pretty much everywhere.
Cary Lowe, any different for you?
No. You can get my book like the others on Amazon or Barnes & Noble, and of course directly from Black Rose. So easy to get, or from your local bookstore. Hopefully you support them as well.
Wonderful. It was a pleasure to have each and every one of you here on the Launchpad Show. To our viewers, thank you. Louella Bryant, Sheltering Angel, a novel, True Stories of the Titanic. Sherry Hobbs Mack, The Wind Beneath My Wings, a biography. Cary Lowe, Becoming American, a memoir. And Amanda Schiavo, in her own right, a novel of Lady Mary Tudor. Thanks so much for being with us here on Launchpad.
Thank you.
This episode is copyrighted by Grace Sammon and Authors on the Air Global Radio Network. Thank you for visiting with us on Launchpad.